We will be screening the short film Segregated by Design, directed by Mark Lopez and based off the book The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America by author Richard Rothstein, who will be joining us for a live question and answer session after the screening. During the film, if you have a question for the author, please drop it in the comments so that our moderating team can see it. We hope that we will be able to, despite all of the spam. We will work to get in as many questions as possible during the time allotted. Following our conversation with Mr. Rothstein, we'll hold a local panel discussion to contextualize this history within Lexington and to talk about our city's housing challenges, including gentrification and displacement. This event began as a recommendation from the Mayor's Commission on Racial Justice and Equity in the Housing and Gentrification Subcommittee. Lexington Community Land Trust was a member of this subcommittee, and we are proud to partner with the Lexington Fair Housing Council and the Lexington Human Rights Commission to present this event this evening. Again, my name is Justin Kirchner. I'm the Director of Homeownership here at Lexington Community Land Trust, and I'll be moderating tonight's discussion and trying to moderate the comments. The film screening was made possible by a generous grant from the PNC Bank Foundation, so we want to thank them as well. So without further ado, we will start with the screening of Segregated by Design, a film by Mark Lopez based on the book The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. Bear with us as we get it queued up.
In the middle of the 20th century, the city of St. Louis, Missouri, and the United States federal government condemned and demolished the neighborhoods in downtown St. Louis where African Americans lived, displacing thousands. They built the Gateway Arch. They built a university, interstate highways, hospitals, and middle-class housing that was unaffordable to the former African American residents. Those who were displaced then relocated to the few other places available, converting inner-ring suburbs like Ferguson into new segregated enclaves. We have been led to believe that racial segregation in housing was de facto segregation, by accident or the result of private prejudices. Yes, private prejudice clearly contributed to segregation, but by itself it could not have segregated the country without the intention of the federal government to segregate neighborhoods throughout the nation. If, however, we understand the accurate history, the history that was once well known but we've all now forgotten, that racially segregated patterns in every metropolitan area like St. Louis were created by de jure segregation, racially explicit policy on the part of federal, state, and local governments designed to segregate metropolitan areas, then we can understand that we have an unconstitutional residential landscape. And if it's unconstitutional, then we have an obligation to remedy it. The federal government in the New Deal of the Roosevelt administration of the 1930s pursued policies in the mid-20th century that segregated metropolitan areas. One important policy was the first civilian public housing program, which frequently demolished integrated neighborhoods in order to create segregated public housing. In the late 1930s, another New Deal program, the United States Housing Authority, was adopted. The very first projects built under the United States Housing Authority authorization were in Austin, Texas, because the most aggressive proponent of public housing at that time was the congressman from Austin, Lyndon Baines Johnson. And Johnson got the United States Housing Authority to put its first projects in Austin, separate projects for whites, for African Americans, and a project for Hispanics. The project for African Americans was placed in a location that the city plan of Austin had designated as a ghetto for African Americans. The United States Housing Authority and the local Austin Housing Authority demolished something called Emancipation Park, which was a celebrations location for the abolition of slavery. The design was to move all African Americans in the city of Austin into this community, whether in public housing or in private housing. The city of Austin then began to close schools for African Americans elsewhere in the city and close libraries and other public facilities to force African Americans to move to the east side. Another program that the federal government pursued to enforce segregation was the work of the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, which subsidized the development of suburbs like Levittown, New York, on condition that they only be sold to white families and that the homes in those suburbs had deeds that prohibited resale to African Americans. The Federal Housing Administration's underwriting manual said that inharmonious racial groups should not be permitted to live in the same communities, meaning that loans to African Americans could not be insured. Government at all levels throughout the nation were involved in promoting and enforcing the restrictive deeds in homes and places like Levittown, and judges enforced the view that these deeds did not violate the Constitution because they were private agreements. Although white middle-class families that moved into suburbs like Levittown could buy property with no down payments if they were veterans and low-interest mortgages, middle-class African Americans had to make substantial down payments and get uninsured mortgages with higher interest rates. In many, if not most cases, African Americans could not get mortgages at all because the federal government would not insure them. As a result, they bought their homes on contract, like an installment plan where they accumulated no equity and could be evicted from their homes in the event of a single missed payment. Thus, contract buyers did not have the option of leaving a declining neighborhood before their properties were paid for in full. If they did, they would lose everything they'd invested in that property to date. The term redlining comes from the federal government's creation of maps of urban areas nationwide. And those maps were color-coded to indicate where it was safe to insure mortgages. Anywhere African Americans lived, even places where African Americans lived nearby, were colored red to indicate to appraisers that these neighborhoods were too risky for the FHA to insure. The FHA's justification was that if African Americans bought homes in white neighborhoods, or even if they bought homes near those neighborhoods, the property values of the homes they were insuring, the white homes they were insuring, would decline, and therefore their loans would be at risk. In 1940, for example, a Detroit builder was denied FHA insurance for a project that was near an African American neighborhood. He then constructed a half-mile concrete wall, 6 feet high and a foot thick, separating the two neighborhoods, and then the FHA approved the loan. In the 3 decades during which it administered this policy, however, the agency never provided or obtained evidence to support its claim that integration undermined property values. In fact, often racial integration caused property values to increase because African Americans' housing supply was so restricted and they had so many fewer choices. If African Americans had access to housing throughout metropolitan areas, supply and demand balances would have kept their rents and home prices at reasonable levels. Without access, landlords and sellers were free to take advantage of the greater demand relative to supply for African American housing. A 1946 National Magazine article described a Chicago building where the landlord had divided a 540-square-foot storefront into 6 cubicles, each housing a family. He had similarly subdivided the second story. Total monthly rent was as great as that generated by a luxury apartment on Chicago's Gold Coast along Lake Michigan. Such exploitation was possible only because public policy denied African Americans opportunities to participate in the city's white housing market. As the federal government concentrated low-income African Americans in single neighborhoods, the homes became overcrowded. Families had to subdivide their homes to make their mortgage payments or their property tax payments. Cities frequently withdrew public services from African American neighborhoods. They collected garbage less frequently. They didn't provide water and sewer services. Polluting industry and toxic waste plants were placed in African American communities in order to protect white neighborhoods from deterioration. The result was that African American neighborhoods frequently turned into slums. White homeowners looked at these places and assumed that slum conditions were characteristics of African Americans, not of government policy that forced this kind of overcrowding. White homeowners then became resistant to African Americans moving into their neighborhoods because they thought they would bring slum conditions with them. Of course, the slums were not created by the people. They were created by the forced concentration, the overcrowding in these neighborhoods. Blockbusting was a scheme in which speculators bought properties in borderline black-white areas, rented or sold them to African American families at above-market prices, persuaded white families residing in these areas that their neighborhoods were turning into African American slums and that values would soon fall precipitously, and then purchased the panicked white homes for less than their worth. Blockbuster's tactics included hiring African American women to push carriages with their babies through white neighborhoods, hiring African American men to drive cars with radios blasting through white neighborhoods, or making random telephone calls to residents of white neighborhoods and asking to speak to someone with a stereotypically African American name, like Johnny May. State licensing agencies that regulated real estate agents could have easily stopped this practice. All they had to do was to lift the license of one or two real estate agents who engaged in these practices, and the practices would have ended. While many de jure segregation policies aim to keep African Americans far from white residential areas, public officials also shifted African American populations away from downtown business districts so that white commuters, shoppers, and business elites would not be exposed to black people. This was accomplished with slum clearance. One slum clearance tool was the construction of the federal interstate highway system. In many cases, state and local governments, with federal acquiescence, designed interstate highway routes to destroy urban African American communities. In the 1950s, there was a white middle-class neighborhood in Los Angeles that wealthy African Americans began to move into. It was called Sugar Hill. The first thing that happened was that the neighborhood association got together and tried to buy out the African American families who were moving in, offering them more money than the African Americans had paid in order to get them out of the neighborhood. When that didn't work, white homeowners tried to enforce a legal agreement prohibiting them from living in the neighborhood. And when that didn't work, the city council then decided it would be an African American neighborhood. It rezoned it for multiple family housing. It eventually became a slum. And then the Santa Monica Freeway was built to clear that slum to destroy the neighborhood. So these policies all worked together in an unconstitutional fashion to segregate Los Angeles. In 1957, Bill and Daisy Myers were able to purchase a home in Levittown, Pennsylvania, the Levitt Company's second large development. When the mail carrier discovered that he was delivering mail to an African-American family, he let everyone in the neighborhood know, and as many as 600 white demonstrators soon showed up in front of the Myers' house, pelting the family and their home with rocks. Law enforcement stood by as this happened. For 2 months, rocks were thrown, crosses were burned, the Ku Klux Klan symbol was painted on the wall next door. Some policemen stood with the mob, joking and encouraging its participants. One sergeant was actually demoted to patrolman because he objected to orders he had been given not to interfere with the rioters. In 1951, World War II veteran Harvey Clark, his wife Janetta, and 2 small children rented an apartment in all-white Cicero, a suburb of Chicago. When the Clarks refused to leave, a mob of 4,000 rioted, raiding the apartment, destroying the fixtures, and throwing the family's belongings out the window onto the lawn where they were set ablaze. Time magazine reported that the police officers present, quote, acted like ushers politely handling the overflow at a football stadium, unquote. The only people that the grand jury indicted were Harvey Clark, his real estate agent, his NAACP attorney, and the white landlady who rented the apartment to him, as well as her attorney, on charges of inciting a riot and conspiring to lower property values. Stories like this were commonplace, and state-sponsored violence was a means, along with many others, by which all levels of government maintained segregation. Today, African American incomes are about 60% of white incomes. But African American wealth is about 10% of white wealth. Most middle-class families in this country gain their wealth from the equity they have in their homes. So this enormous difference between a 60% income ratio and a 10% wealth ratio is almost entirely attributable to federal housing policy implemented through the 20th century. African American families that were prohibited from buying homes in the suburbs in the 1940s and 50s, and even into the 60s by the Federal Housing Administration, gained none of the equity appreciation that whites gained. Across the country in new developments, these homes in the late 1940s and 1950s sold for about twice national median income. They were affordable to working-class families with an FHA or VA mortgage. African Americans were equally able to afford those homes as whites, but were prohibited from buying them. Today, those homes sell for $300,000 to $400,000 at the minimum, 6 to 8 times national median income. The white families sent their children to college with the wealth they gained from appreciating home equity. They were able to take care of their parents in old age and not depend on their children. They were able to bequeath wealth to their children. None of those advantages accrued to African Americans, who for the most part were prohibited from buying homes in those suburbs. So in 1968, we passed the Fair Housing Act that said, in effect, okay, African Americans, you're now free to buy homes in the suburbs that had been forbidden. But it's an empty promise, because those homes are no longer affordable to the families whose parents or grandparents could have afforded them when whites were buying into those suburbs and gaining the equity and wealth that followed from their purchases. Consider children who come from families where they're economically stressed, or in poor health because they have no access to good health care, or because they live in polluted environments. When they do come to school, for example, they may suffer from asthma because of that pollution and are drowsy from being awake at night, wheezing. They cannot then typically achieve at levels of children who come to school well rested. When you concentrate children like that in single classrooms, it's impossible for teachers to develop the kind of outcomes that they can in middle-class children who come to school healthy, unstressed, and able to pay attention to schooling. What economists know is that African American children from low-income families who grow up in segregated neighborhoods are less likely as adults to move into the middle class than are African American children whose families have the same low incomes but who live in integrated neighborhoods. So segregation itself impedes intergenerational mobility and perpetuates, rigidifies the inequality that we experience. Another thing that social psychologists have discovered is that decision-making is hampered when you don't have diverse decision-making groups. These psychologists have done experiments where they put people together to solve problems in both diverse groups and in segregated groups. And the diverse groups are much better able to solve problems because they challenge assumptions much more than the segregated groups do. So segregation impedes our political and economic success. We have 3 provisions in the federal Constitution that prohibit the kinds of actions that federal, state, and local governments pursued to create residential segregation. One is the Fifth Amendment, which requires the federal government to treat all citizens fairly. Another is the 14th Amendment, that requires state and local governments not only to treat citizens fairly, but to treat them equally. And then the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, also requires that we banish the effects of slavery, which Congress long ago determined was any form of second-class citizenship. So in fact, the prohibition on African Americans to purchase homes in federally subsidized white communities or the segregation of public housing created a form of second-class citizenship which was a violation of the 13th Amendment. We cannot reverse de jure segregation mainly with lawsuits. We must also build a national political consensus leading to legislation, a challenging but not impossible task. Our focus now should be to develop policies that promote an integrated society, understanding it will be impossible to fully untangle the web of unconstitutional inequality that we've woven. To begin, we should first contemplate what we have collectively done and, on behalf of our government, accept responsibility to fix it.
Well, we hope that the video was enlightening for everyone as we live stream this out. Again, I do want to mention, do not click on links in the comments section. But we are now happy to welcome author of The Color of Law, Richard Rothstein,
Hello there.
with us. Yeah, so we have some great questions coming from the comments of the live stream, but we wanted to start things off, again, thanking you for being here, thanking you for your work on The Color of Law. This is the second time Lexington CLT has hosted you. We hosted a community forum with you back in 2018, so thank you again for being here.
Oh, I remember.
Wonderful. So to start things off, your book, while it's rooted in history, it discusses the real and tangible effects that segregationist policies continue to have on communities today. So how does this legacy of redlining and systemic discrimination still impact lives? And what interventions have you seen cities put forward to create more equitable communities?
Well, the biggest ongoing impact of the unconstitutional policies that government followed in the mid-20th century is the ongoing racial wealth gap. Because white families were subsidized to move into all-white single-family suburbs in the mid-20th century. At inexpensive prices, African Americans were prohibited by federal policy from participating in this program. Those neighborhoods, those suburban neighborhoods, increased in value over time. The families, the white families who purchased them, gained wealth as they gained equity in those homes through the appreciation of land in their communities. Black families were prohibited from participating in this wealth-generating program. As a result, today, the typical African-American family has income at about 60% the rate of a white family income. You'd think that you'd have a 60% wealth as well. Families can save the same amount of money from the same incomes, but in reality, although there's African-American families have income at 60% the rate of whites, African-American wealth is only 5% of the rate of whites. And that enormous disparity between the 60% income ratio and the 5% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional policy that you saw described in that video that the federal government practiced in the mid-20th century. And that wealth gap underlies almost all of the racial inequality that we see today. It locks African Americans into less well-resourced neighborhoods than whites. They don't have down payments, typically, that white families have from the accumulation of that wealth, that they're locked into lower resource neighborhoods, results in achievement gap in schools. African American children achieve less because they come to school with so many social and economic disadvantages that overwhelm their ability to take advantage of what even the best schools can offer. Lead poisoning, poor health from asthma, all of these affect achievement. Homelessness, this is all a result, an ongoing result of those unconstitutional policies. Health disparities between African Americans and whites can be traced to that wealth gap. African Americans, as I say, they live in less healthy neighborhoods in the first place. They have less access to markets that sell fresh food. They breathe less healthy air. It's also responsible, to significant extent, to the mass incarceration of young African American men. I'm not suggesting that the police would never abuse young black men if it weren't for the fact that they were segregated by this inability to afford homes outside low-income neighborhoods. But it's much more intense when you concentrate the most disadvantaged young men in single neighborhoods without access to good jobs or transportation to get to those jobs, or schools that aren't overwhelmed by the social and economic problems of their students. It's inevitable that the police are going to adopt habits that are characteristic of occupying forces everywhere, who are assigned the role of keeping a restive, low-income population under control. The way police behave in our urban neighborhoods is not much different from the way occupying police forces behaved in colonial countries in the 20th century. And then there's a final effect of this wealth gap, which I think is very dangerous and frightening. I imagine that most of you will agree, and that is the enormous political polarization in this country that largely tracks racial lines. It's not entirely racial, but how can we ever expect to develop the common national identity that we need to preserve this democracy if so many African Americans and whites live so far from each other that we can't identify with each other, that we can't empathize with each other, that we don't understand each other's life experiences. So those are the ongoing consequences of just one federal policy that created this wealth gap through the suburbanization on a whites-only basis of the working and lower middle classes in this country. So far as what's being done in different places, well, there are many, many communities that are taking small steps to redress segregation, but they're all small. There's not the political support today to do what's really necessary. But certainly a land trust is one solution, and there are other communities besides Lexington that are implementing that. There are communities that have down payment assistance programs that help first-time home buyers who are disproportionately African American or Hispanic to purchase homes. There are communities that do a better job of placing more of their low-income housing tax credit units in higher opportunity communities. Not a much better job, but a somewhat better job. It still reinforces segregation because most of those projects are placed in existing low-income neighborhoods, reinforcing their segregation. There are some communities that have prohibited discrimination against Section 8 voucher holders who are also disproportionately African American and Hispanic. Under the Fair Housing Act, landlords are permitted to discriminate against a potential renter that has refused to rent to somebody whose rent is partially paid by the federal government. That should be prohibited everywhere, not just in the few communities that do it. So there are many, many policies that we know could redress segregation. We're not doing many of them because there's no political support. We need a new civil rights movement in this country that's going to make it uncomfortable to maintain the present policies of segregation.
Sure, thank you. So a large conversation that's happening here in Lexington is about the long-term effect of that disinvestment, which is manifesting itself as gentrification. So redlining often manifests as systemic disinvestment from Black and Brown communities throughout the US. This disinvestment suppressed property values and limited that intergenerational wealth that you had just mentioned. So today, because of these suppressed property values, we're seeing the same neighborhoods that were redlined now facing gentrification and displacement. So do you see a relationship between the two? And if so, what are some things that you've seen that have helped stymie that gentrification?
Well, I said a minute ago, the policies to redress segregation are well known. We know how to prevent gentrification from causing massive displacement of the existing population. Gentrification could be a very healthy thing if it did not result in massive displacement. It would make those communities better resourced. It would improve the schools. It would improve the public services. But what's happening in too many cases, I don't know of any place that successfully stopped it. What's happening in too many places is that as gentrification proceeds, it converts a segregated low-income community into a segregated high-income community, a segregated Black community, low income into a segregated high-income white community. But we know what to do. If we were serious about proceeding with gentrification while preventing massive displacements, so we ended up with a healthy, integrated community, we would implement vigorous rent control, not just token rent control, but serious rent control that limited rent increases to the rate of inflation. We would have limits on condominium conversions, something that municipalities can enact. We would have inclusionary zoning ordinances that require developments of a minimum size to set aside a share of units not only for low-income families, but for moderate-income families, working class families who live in that community, but who can soon no longer afford to remain living there as prices rise. And we should implement a freeze on property taxes for existing homeowners, because one of the causes of massive displacement is you have families that own their home free and clear, but can no longer afford to live in them because the property taxes increase so much. And if they paid property taxes at their initial purchase price rate, the property taxes could be returned to the Treasury if they later sold their homes at a profit. Instead of making hundreds of thousands of dollars in capital gains, they can make a few $1,000s less than that by returning lost property taxes to the Treasury. So these are policies, as I say, they're well-known policies. Policymakers know what to do. The reason we're not doing it is not because we don't know what to do. The reason we're not doing it is because we don't have political support. We don't have a new civil rights movement in this country that's going to make it necessary to implement these kinds of policies.
So you mentioned zoning being a large portion of not only the issue, but also a possible solution through inclusionary zoning. You know, Lexington, our neighbor of Louisville, is featured heavily in your book, The Color of Law, because of its prominence with the case of Buchanan versus Worley. Can you talk a little bit about this case out of Louisville and how it helped to create exclusionary racial zoning?
Yes, well, Louisville does figure prominently in my book. In fact, I got started with the book because of a Supreme Court case that involved Louisville. Just a recent one, 2007. I read this case in which Chief Justice John Roberts said that the government had nothing to do with segregating Louisville. And I remembered the case, and you know this, I'm sure, as well. People in your community know the case of Carl Braden, who in the 1950s, in the all-white suburb of Shively, sold a home to an African-American family, and the police, the prosecutors, the courts, through state-sponsored violence, preserved the racial boundaries of Louisville. So the government of Louisville, the government of Kentucky, was very much involved in creating that segregation. So far as Buchanan v. Worley, there were, in the early 20th century, a number of jurisdictions, particularly in border states like Kentucky. Baltimore was actually the first one, adopted ordinances that prohibited African Americans from moving to blocks where whites were a majority. These were integrated cities at the time. These ordinances would have made no sense if they weren't already integrated, and prohibited whites from moving to blocks where African Americans were a majority. The Supreme Court prohibited those ordinances in Louisville and in Baltimore and in other cities and border states on the grounds that it interfered with homeowners' property rights to sell to whomever they chose. It was not a racial decision primarily, but it effectively prohibited explicit racial zoning. But that didn't prevent cities and counties from coming up with devices to evade that ruling. Shortly after that ruling, Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover convened a committee to promulgate facially race-neutral zoning ordinances around the country as a way of getting around Buchanan v. Worley. Those ordinances that were stimulated around the country as a result of Secretary Hoover's work permitted communities to zone residentially at different levels, effectively prohibiting people of different income classes, which was really a proxy for race at that time. In some cases, it was racially explicit from living among one another. There were other ways that they evaded this. In many cases, city plans not zoning ordinances, but city plans, designated areas by race, and then areas that were designated by race for African Americans were places where industrial uses were permitted, where polluting industry was permitted, toxic waste dumps were permitted, and areas designated for whites were residential only. It was not a racial ordinance. It was simply a way to evade Buchanan v. Worley. So today, those exclusionary zoning ordinances that we have perpetuate segregation and make it more difficult to redress segregation. But the exclusionary zoning ordinances should be abolished. In my judgment, they're subject to challenge because they perpetuate an unconstitutionally created segregation. But abolishing exclusionary zoning ordinances themselves won't accomplish it. In addition, you need things like inclusionary zoning. Abolishing exclusionary zoning simply in many cases will permit developers to build high-cost condos rather than single-family homes. And that won't do anything to redress segregation. So we need a further step beyond abolishing exclusionary zoning ordinances. We need inclusionary zoning of the kind I talked about before. We need programs which exist in many cities, but still small programs of down payment assistance for first-time home buyers who are disproportionately African American and Hispanic. We need explicit racial policies to redress segregation. We didn't create it with race-neutral policies. We can't undo it with race-neutral policies.
So we had a question along those lines. You discuss how in a post-civil rights era, race-neutral, or as some would call colorblind policies, really only serve to reinforce those discriminatory systems in which they were created. So we'd love to hear a little bit more about that and your thoughts on the need to take those affirmative steps and affirmative actions that you in the book call remedies.
Well, I am working on a new book that will go into great detail about what we should do to redress segregation. I'm also involved with a group of national civil rights leaders and fair housing leaders to create something we call a new movement to redress racial segregation that will be engaged in creating local committees to take direct action to try to change the political temperature of the segregation policies. There are many policies we can follow, both public and private. One thing that I wrote an article in the Times a few months ago, which I can share with your participants, your attendees, if you like. I can send you when we're done links to these things, but in which I described a community, an all-white community that was created as a segregated all-white community in the mid-20th century, and identified the developer, the real estate agency, and the bank that cooperated with the federal government to create that segregated community. Those private institutions still exist today. A civil rights movement in that community, and the same thing can be done anywhere, should be engaged in a campaign to get that bank, that real estate agency, that developer now to be part of the solution, perhaps to set up a voluntary reparations fund that subsidizes African Americans to move into that community, which was affordable to them when it was created, but is unaffordable to even middle class and working class African Americans today. I'm not talking about poor people. Only a minority of African Americans are poor. Most are working class, middle class, but they can't afford to move into communities that would have been available to them when they were affordable, but from which they were prohibited. So that's a purely private action that the civil rights group can take. Publicly, the government should also be engaged in that kind of affirmative action. It should be buying up homes at market rates today in these exclusive white communities that the government created as whites only, and reselling them at deeply discounted prices to African Americans whose forebears would have been able to live in that community had they been permitted to do so. At the low end of the income scale, there are policies that we should be following. to ensure the end of segregation. But right now, the policies we follow, as you just mentioned, reinforce segregation. The low-income housing tax credit program, for example, places a priority on putting low-income housing tax credit units in existing low-income neighborhoods, reinforcing their segregation. I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't put any low-income units there. We should. Every community should have better housing. But we should also be placing them in high-opportunity places where families can have access to good jobs and transportation to get to those jobs. And as I said, grocery stores selling healthy food, or schools that aren't overwhelmed with the social and economic problems of their students. The Section 8 voucher program is also one that presently reinforces segregation, because most Section 8 vouchers are usable only in low-income segregated neighborhoods. The way in which the voucher amount is calculated reinforces segregation, even though it's presumably race neutral. The amount of the voucher is based on the median rent in a metropolitan area. But as anybody can understand, the median rent is going to be too low to afford to rent an apartment in a high opportunity place, and too high to rent an apartment in a low-income segregated neighborhood. The reality is that landlords in low-income segregated neighborhoods exploit the Section 8 program by charging more than the market would otherwise require. There are a few experimental places, cities in this country, that adjust their Section 8 vouchers to make them higher for families who choose to live in higher opportunity places, and lower for families who choose to live in segregated neighborhoods, still adequate to enable them to rent there if they wish. But that kind of policy should be enacted everywhere. We should prohibit discrimination against Section 8 voucher holders. The Fair Housing Act permits landlords to refuse to sell to rent to Section 8 voucher holders. That should be prohibited.
So you touched, on the political will and the lacking of political will, especially at every level of government, city, state, and federal. How do you respond? Your book does an amazing job of putting together this concise history, but how do you respond when people say systemic or institutional racism doesn't exist, when many of these institutions and laws that were created during that time, these covenants still stand on houses, these deed restrictions still stand on houses? So how do you respond when folks say that institutional racism doesn't exist? How can we break through that political apathy?
Well, I guess I tell them to read my book. That's one thing. This new movement to redress racial segregation that I'm part of, and as I say, I can let your attendees know how to find out more about it, has school curricula that it is promoting and distributing. If the next generation doesn't learn this history any better than ours have, they're going to be in as poor a position to remedy as we have. And schools continue to teach the myth of de facto segregation as though it all just happened by accident. That should be redressed. And local civil rights groups could engage in campaigns to get school districts to adopt a more accurate curriculum. But, you can tell by looking at me, I'm an old man. I remember things that when I was young were considered inconceivable and that then happened. Do I have a minute to tell a quick story? No? Okay, I'll skip it. I'll just say that I remember things. And a new civil rights movement can make things happen now that are considered inconceivable today.
Sure. So as we do wind down a little bit, I did want to ask, so your book came out in 2017. In 2018, as I mentioned, Lexington Community Land Trust hosted you for our community forum here in Lexington. But a lot has happened since then. We've had the Black Lives Matter movement come to the forefront. A lot of cities have made, some have made substantive steps, some have made, have paid lip service to these issues that we're talking about today. So I wanted to ask you, have you seen meaningful progress in the desegregation of our cities? And how have you seen this conversation develop since your book came out and since you last came to Lexington?
Well, my book is only part of the um, ongoing discussion we're having, and a small part. There are other books as well. If you look at the bestseller lists, you'll see that not only mine, but there are many books about our racial history on those lists. Certainly, the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, 20 million Americans participated in those demonstrations. They were led by African Americans, but the majority of participants were white. We're having a more accurate and passionate discussion about the legacies of slavery and Jim Crow today than we ever have had before in American history. So that's changed. I had trouble getting my book published. The publishers, when I first sent it around, said we were in a post-racial society and nobody's interested in this stuff anymore. We're now having this conversation. Out of it, I'm hopeful that a new civil rights movement will emerge. That's why we began to organize this new movement to redress racial segregation. It wasn't conceivable when I first published the book. So out of this new awareness and the discussions that we're having, a direct action movement can take place. The discussions are necessary, but the discussions themselves don't make change.
Absolutely, yes. And we've certainly seen in the comments that appetite for substantive action. So we will actually begin to pivot then from a conversation with Mr. Rothstein to a local panel discussion with some of these local leaders who are looking to implement some of these policies that we've been discussing thus far. So to Mr. Rothstein, I want to say thank you again for joining us. Thank you for the book, The Color of Law, and the subsequent film. We definitely appreciate your time today.
Well, thank you. And Mark Lopez deserves much more of the credit for that film than I do. So
Absolutely.
Thank him. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Thank you.
All right, so we will now pivot with Councilmember James Brown and PG Peoples joining the chat. And Dr. Richard Shine as well. So thank you all for joining us today. I hope that didn't keep you waiting in the waiting room too long there. Is everyone connected, and do we have audio on Councilmember Brown, Mr. Peoples, and Dr. Shine?
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, I want to thank each of you for joining us today. We just had a wonderful presentation by author Richard Rothstein and a screening of the film Segregated by Design. So I really wanted to come together with this group to chat about more local opportunities for action, as well as a little bit of the history of Lexington in this sordid history of segregation, of redlining, and now what we see today in gentrification and displacement. So that brings me to my first question, which is all three of you served as members of the Mayor's Commission on Racial Justice and Equity, which prepared reports on health inequities, economic inequities, housing inequities, amongst many others. So I wanted to read a quick excerpt from the Housing and Gentrification Subcommittee's report. Historically, African-American neighborhoods in Lexington have been communities full of history, culture, and unique experiences. Gentrification, if left unchecked, erases and refuses to preserve the cultural histories that birthed these neighborhoods. It is upon us to correct this governmentally sponsored wrong. So the film we just watched, Segregated by Design, ends by saying, the next step forward is to take responsibility. Councilmember Brown, I'll start with you. Is this report fulfilling that recommendation from Mr. Rothstein to take responsibility for this past injustice through it is upon us to correct this governmentally sponsored wrong? Or is there a larger conversation happening at City Hall about ways that we can accept responsibility for this?
I think the intent of the the Commission on Racial Justice and Equality is to address systematic racism. You know, one of the recommendations from that subcommittee, the Housing and Gentrification, was a statement of acknowledgement from the city and the role that it has played. So I think that's, you know, that's the first step. But I think, you know, the mayor has brought on Lisa Higgins Howard to work and address these recommendations in a systematic way that is hopefully free from the politics that go into it. So I think it is a holistic approach that we need to take as a city to address these issues. And you know, in the film, it talked about the policies on all levels, the state, the federal, and the local level, and then it tied it back into the achievement gap or the lack of academic success and how it impacts neighborhoods and families, especially Black families, in regards to not having opportunity. So I think we really have to address the root causes and not just put Band-Aids on what we're seeing happening in our neighborhoods.
Absolutely. So I do want to open it up. We want to have a full conversation here with Mr. Peoples and Dr. Shine. So, we want to feel free to come off of mute as everyone feels comfortable. So, Mr. Peoples, Councilmember Brown just mentioned the achievement gap. Now, Lexington Urban League does a lot of work in both affordable housing and education. So as an affordable housing developer, proponent of education, how can we continue to close both the achievement gap that Councilmember Brown just mentioned, as well as the wealth gap through what Mr. Rothstein was discussing?
Before I talk about the achievement gap, first I want to give credit to our superintendent who passed. He was a living example of how to address the achievement gap. So his passing is very saddened me and a lot of us who had been fighting that uphill battle for so long and dealing with this community that was for so long in denial about the reality of an achievement gap. So right now I'm a bit concerned about where do we go from here. I think I would be lying if I didn't say that I'm concerned about and hoping that we're going to have a school board that for the first time in a long time is all white, that they're going to have the sensitivities necessary to understand the African American population and the issues that we deal with. So that's kind of disheartening. The the gentrification issue. Let's don't kid ourselves. This happened right before our very eyes. Yeah, I've been doing affordable housing in the urban core since 1985, starting on Chestnut Street, and we've got a lot of work to do to push back on gentrification that's happening in our neighborhoods. I chuckle now as I drive around town and come on the north side of Main Street. And I've always referred to Main Street as our Mason-Dixon line. But when you come north side of Main Street, some of the realtors posters that you see on the north side now that you never saw 10, 20 years ago. That's a sign that gentrification is live and well, and that we've got a lot of work to do. Let me just leave it at that.
Dr. Shine, Mr. Peoples just touched on his view of Main Street as a Mason-Dixon line. As a cultural geographer, how has things like redlining impacted the development of Lexington, the neighborhoods in Lexington. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Sure, sure. First, I want to thank you for inviting me and say how honored I am first to be with PG Peoples, who I've never met in person, but I've been reading about him for 30 years. And James Brown, who I really enjoyed getting to know on the task force. I also got to put a plug in here. You know, if we had more time and we did other things, and I get to share a screen, I brought maps and things that answer some of that question. We probably won't have time to show that. But I'd like to also represent the University of Kentucky, who's not always been the best neighbor in Lexington. We know that if you've been here for a long time. But I'm really heartened by the announcement yesterday, getting to listen to Henry Louis Gates Jr. give a talk in honor of the opening of the Institute for Black Studies at UK, founded by my brilliant colleagues Anastasia Kerwood and Damaris Hill, and working with Vanessa Holden on a post-slavery project. And I think they'll engage exactly these kinds of conversations. And then the Department of Geography Map Shop, the brainchild of my colleague Matt Wilson, who's provided lots of maps for the various task forces that have been around, and for many of the ways in which I see the city. The short answer is yes. It's a little bit harder, I think, to see redlining, although I have a slightly different definition of redlining than Mr. Rothstein. I certainly agree with him, and I know those home ownership corporation loans. I have one on my screen of Lexington, which shows the central part of town and the East End in red, showing exactly how what he's talking about was the case in Lexington in the 1930s. Redlining also has a broader definition. I also have a map here that I won't show you, but it's a map of St. Louis in the 1930s by the Real Estate Commission, which is not a public entity. It's a private entity of realtors, but it's a map of census tracts of St. Louis, designated by, as they say at the time, % of the district that is Negro population, and every single district that is above a certain percentage of people of color has a red line around it. And it's literally the redlining of mortgage disinvestment, places where they will not lend money. I think I say that because I absolutely think that book is fabulous. It's fantastic for showing us the kind of the power of law. But I think we also have to remember that when we talk about these things, I'll push us back a little bit. We don't talk just about government, but we talk about governance, the broader sense of how a city is run. We used to talk about cities as growth machines, about the powerful coalitions of capital and government, especially, but also educational institutions who were interested in basically city growth. And I think there are lots of things that went on in Lexington that involved other folks, the siting of Thoroughbred Park, the deed covenanting of Ashland Park, which were done by private folks, but then supported. And I think Mr. Rothstein shows in his book very well. They're supported in the ways that they were never attacked or never called out as illegal. So that's a rather long answer to start with.
No, thank you for that. You mentioned these redlining maps that we have for Lexington. What I'd like to do is, if you can compile those resources, I'd love to send it out to the participants after this event. I think that information definitely should be in the hands of the people. We had a comment on the live stream about some of the fences around some of the communities in downtown Lexington. And I know you've done some specific research on fences and gates in downtown Lexington, to be symbolic of racial discrimination and of redlining, and so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that history.
Sure. It's I think when we talk about the things, how do I want to say this? I'll repeat how much I really enjoyed that book. And even though the book starts in 1877 with Reconstruction and mentions the 13th, 14th, 5th Amendment, 15th Amendment, the Civil Rights Acts of 66 and 1875, but the book's really about the urban transformation of the United States after we became urban in the 1920s. And in that sense, it's almost mostly about northern cities and the ways in which segregation was enforced through all kinds of government programs. I think that Lexington as a southern city is a slightly different place, and I'm happy to share maps, and I'm actually going to talk with our map shop about making those kinds of things public. But you know, Lexington became I mean, there were free people of color living in Lexington all over the city in 1860, unsegregated. There were mass movement of formerly enslaved people to Lexington in the 1870s to the 1880s as they left the horse farms, left the agricultural surrounding countryside and settled in pockets all over the central downtown. And we still know some of these places. They're powerful places that have strong communities to some extent. Smithtown, for example, or Paultown, Bracktown, Brucetown, all these kinds of places. And so Lexington in the 19th century had a very different sort of cheek by jowl existence of racial segregation. It was segregation. It was not necessarily legal, and it was then codified as we came into the 20th century through the arrival of Jim Crow, probably more likely here through things like deed covenants. One of the things that I'll provide with you is, I'll tell the story of two stories of Ashland Park, which is the neighborhood, the first real sort of upper middle class 20th century neighborhood south of the city. I lived there 30 years ago. My deed still had a deed covenant on it that said I could not sell this property to a black person. If you look at a contemporary map of race in Lexington and look at where the absolutely strongest white-black boundary is, it's at the boundary of Ashland Park. Those kinds of things still exist.
So with those effects of redlining and previous discrimination, Mr. Peoples, you said that in a housing and gentrification subcommittee meeting, we needed these hard-hitting recommendations that match the seriousness of the situation. And obviously what Mr. Shine or what Dr. Shine just described was a very serious situation where we have this not only de facto segregation, but de jure segregation where it was codified in law and in deeds. So can you speak a little bit about your assessment of segregation and gentrification here in Lexington? And what policies do you think would be most urgent to enact to combat these things?
How about one of them? I think that was mentioned earlier, the putting a ceiling on the taxes that low-income people are paying in neighborhoods. I'll often talk about the hypothetical situation of a family who probably in the 50s raised their family in one of these neighborhoods, working African-American family, hardworking father and mother raised their family, and now their family's gone and they're in their mother's home and anticipating the golden years, and now because of taxes are unable to stay in there. That's criminal. And I think that's when the responsibility, falls back upon the government for us to adjust those taxes such that the people moving in who can afford the higher taxes don't displace our people. I think the gentleman who I was on with earlier, Richard mentioned that even gentrified neighborhoods, meaning changing them, does not necessarily mean that we have to move people out. There are ways that we can do that and still have healthy integrated neighborhoods. And I'm a strong proponent of that. And I think if we do enough of that, it will make a difference.
Absolutely, yeah. So capping property taxes, we had heard some earlier solutions as well. Councilmember Brown, a lot of the conversation with Mr. Rothstein centered around political will. How can we build that consensus both at City Hall, and we've had a few comments about, a lot of the state preemption that happens here in Kentucky. So how can we work with both state and local leaders to create these equitable policies to create a more inclusive city?
Justin, I think what we said earlier, first you have to start with acknowledgement that policy plays a role. the policies help create and enhance the division and the segregation that we experience in our city. Now market factors and market forces are encouraging it and actually moving it more aggressively. And now we got to look at creating policies that empower and also protect our most vulnerable, which a lot of times are African American and Black communities. What PG said about taxes and protecting folks that own property to be able to stay in their homes and property is one of the most important factors. I mean, if we give folks the opportunity to build wealth and to help stabilize neighborhoods, you know, that would help carry us forward and give folks an opportunity to stay in place and not be displaced. But I think now the other thing that Mr. Rothstein said is, he didn't say it this way, but what he said is prevent increased density in some of these neighborhoods. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing, partly because of our growth strategy, we're seeing increased density in in our neighborhoods, partly because affordable housing is such at a deficit that we're looking to create more rental units to try to keep folks in place. But a lot of times I think that could be helping to exacerbate the issue and the challenge that we have. I think home ownership and the opportunity to build wealth will help stabilize the neighborhood in addition to create affordable rental units. But I think there's a challenge with that. And what I'll say, you know, in regards to our city's comprehensive plan, we need more folks at the table. We need more community engagement as we create goals and objectives and have input into the city's comprehensive plan, because right now our current growth strategy is help driving some of these forces that we are seeing that is creating displacement and the lack of affordable housing in our city. So I hope that answered your question, but I think it's, you know, we have to acknowledge our role. We have to acknowledge the policies that exist. And then he also says something else, and I'll pass the microphone back, is race neutral policies. I remember being on a committee one time, and the committee decided not to use race as a factor. All we used was income. We decided to look at socioeconomic status, and we were making decisions based on that. But what we found out later is that we were actually impacting people of color, Black and brown communities and families without looking at that. And I think now, you know, hindsight, we have to take off those goggles and actually be more intentional about the decisions that we make and how they affect other folks in our community, Black and brown families and residents.
Sure. So Dr. Shine and Mr. Peoples, you know, in terms of more affirmative steps and more affirmative actions and not being as race neutral, do you see those as policies to move forward to combat what we're seeing today?
If I could, I'm not a policy person, but I'm going to make a comment about some policy we have here. And I really appreciate Councilman Brown's reminder of the impossibility, I would say, of doing race neutral when we're talking about these topics. You know, that was one of the main points of the book, The Color of Law, is that all these decisions were made ostensibly in the context of the market, but the market itself was fixed, and the market itself was racialized and was racist. And I think that's really important to remember. But I think Councilman Brown's absolutely right about political will. It takes political will, and I'm going to raise an elephant in the room, and I'm probably going to get flack for it. And I was always for it, but you know, we had the political will in the 1990s here to preserve our green space and to preserve our farmland outside the service boundary through a purchase development rights program that we spent millions and millions of dollars on. I think it was probably a good thing, but there were city issued bonds, there were state grants, there were investment tobacco buyout funds, there were federal matching dollars. we saved over 30,000 acres on 277 farms. If we could turn that political will into looking to the downtown areas or the disinvested in areas of our city, we could probably do something. But it means we have to recognize we've done this before, but we've privileged a certain part of the city and a certain group of folks, and we need to look at other folks as well here. One of the things that we put in that report, which is I have no idea how it would work, but we discovered that the city of Austin is, I think, maybe the first place in the country to experiment with something called an equity overlay zone. And it's an attempt to look at a way to use a kind of a zoning tool, the way we use overlay zones for historic preservation, which we've used here, not always in good ways, to look at an equity overlay zone as a way to bring together some of these ideas where we could think about reinvestment or forgiving or basing taxes on pre-reassessed gentrified values. The final thing I want to say, and I'll get, as I like that, I'll give the mic back, is I actually take issue with the notion that was said in the film that, or in the commentary earlier, that we could have gentrification if we didn't have displacement. I think that misses the point that gentrification is by definition displacement. That is the definition of gentrification. And it could be physical displacement, and it could be cultural displacement, it could be economic displacement. So I think we just need to think about perhaps redefining urban redevelopment or some other term rather than say we're going to fix gentrification, because we're not.
Sure. So both you and Councilmember Brown touched on, bringing these, not only bringing voices to the table, but actually listening to them and creating policies based on community input. Mr. Peoples, you've worked in, especially the East End for, a number of years. In terms of what you hear from residents on Chestnut Street, as you mentioned before, what are they looking for in terms of city policy, and how can we actually create those policies that are responsive to the neighborhoods themselves?
Well, we want to see more down payment assistance. And this may be just a little bit off the beaten path from gentrification. We've also got to, again, focus more on police protection in the Chestnut Street area. Chestnut Street was once one of the safest areas in our community. The area now around 4th and Chestnut is frightening. And I know that the police are talking about focusing more on that. That makes it difficult for those of us who are trying to do affordable housing to get people to move in. And if you're already a small developer, a small builder, with very limited lines of credit and so forth, you cannot afford to build a unit and sit on it. So it creates a double problem for people like the Urban League. So yes, we need to address our police protection in that area a lot more than we're doing to this point. I think James might agree with me on that one.
PG, I do agree with you. I think the other factor there is the lack of home ownership in a few blocks. Also, aids, it also ties into the disinvestment and pride in the neighborhood. I think we got some vacant units, and we need to get, it'd be good if we got some homeowners in there or some renters. But when an area like that sees neglect and has vacant units, it's a challenge to build community pride and that sort of thing. And that's just something that we have to work on. But that's what sets the stage for flipping and buying the properties and raising property values. We want to see the investment. We just don't want to see the displacement.
when we first started, it was not difficult. All of our first 75 to 80 units were home ownership. And things changed somewhat. And it was after the, 2008, 2009, when things went bad in the market. And we had difficulty moving those home ownership units. We had to spend more time trying to do rental in order to keep our corporation going. And now that's going south on us. It's just tough to do the business that we have to do. And the government's going to have to help us more. We'll need more subsidy. And I'll tell you one thing that's keeping me up at night, guys, is post-pandemic, it could be even worse. When we think about the policies that are in place now that keep people from evictions, when that's lifted, there could be a tsunami of people that we'll have to figure out what to do with. It's tough. This city is going to have to really pull together around all of the recommendations that's in the commission report. And I think we can. I've always referred to Lexington as a can-do community, but I do worry about where we are right now and what our next steps are going to be. But together we can get through it.
So you brought up something that's on the mind of a lot of folks, both in the affordable housing and housing activist world, which is what will happen post-pandemic. After the 2008 housing collapse, we saw, massive foreclosures and things like that happen. And then following those foreclosures, investment came in, from say the 40502 zip code into the 40508 zip code. Causing massive displacement and starting off a lot of the gentrification that we're seeing today. So what can we do, before it gets to that point, before these eviction moratoriums are lifted, before the foreclosure crisis post-COVID happens? What can we do proactively to ensure that, a repeat of 2008 doesn't happen?
Justin, I think what we're trying to do and focus on here at the city is provide rental assistance to folks right now, so it doesn't snowball at the end. But I think to PG's point, I think some of that is going to be unpreventable. So we just gotta look at ways to help subsidize some of these housing costs. I thought about what Mr. Rothstein was saying as far as the investment that needs to take place in regards to whether it's down payment assistance or a special program that is set in place to help the Black community purchase homes and have the opportunity to build wealth. But I think we're all waiting to see what it looks like at the end, and in the meantime, we just got to do everything that we can to try to keep people from being in a situation where they're going to be displaced once we come out of this and all the moratoriums are lifted as far as evictions. The other thing too is the property owners. They're going to be in a situation where some of them are just going to have to sell just to try to get some of those properties off their books, and then hopefully the folks that come in and buy and have the ability to buy understand what our challenges are as a community and are sensitive to preventing displacement and trying to keep people in these neighborhoods that they've been in, some of them their whole lives.
So
we're talking post-pandemic. We'd be remiss if we didn't also mention the concerns that we have about what is going to be with the academic losses with low-income kids post-pandemic, having been out of school for a year. And they'll be affected more seriously than their counterparts. I'm not trying to be one who's just raising all the red flags, but I'm a realist, and I guess the older I get, the more realistic I become. That these are issues that are going to compound themselves post-pandemic.
PG, I don't think that's a doomsday prediction. I think that's a reality, and I know it's been a conversation among several council members about what we can do at City Hall to make sure there are resources for agencies that can provide additional academic support for these students, because they're going to need it, a lot of them, as we come out of this.
So that brings up, a question that has been asked, which is, with our current structure of revenue in the city, property taxes go towards, mostly the school district. So what we're seeing is in a lot of these traditionally disinvested communities that were redlined, are now seeing underperforming schools. So how can we create access to opportunity through affordable housing, et cetera, in some of the best school districts in the city, instead of continuing to, concentrate poverty in certain neighborhoods?
Can I ask a question? Because I don't know the answer to that, but Mr. Peoples and Mr. Brown may. So maybe I'm misunderstood, but years ago I used to read Merlene Davis religiously in the Lexington Herald Leader, who commented on a lot of these things. And I thought that the school district in Lexington, we can talk about underperforming schools, and the traditional way of doing that in cities like Mr. Rothstein is writing about is because of the school districts and different actual political boundaries. But these schools are all inside the city. Is there underfunding from school to school inside the district? Marlene Davis always used to write about at that point that it was more about expectations of kids in school in many ways than the underfunding. But I don't know. That's a question I have as well.
PG, you want me to take the first stab at it? I don't think it's underfunding in regards to the school system, funding each school. I think it's the supplemental support that comes from the families of the young people that attend the schools. And then we have some schools or some neighborhoods that are in situations where students move from low performing school to low performing school to low performing school. And in some of these low performing schools, no criticism to the schools, the staff, or their efforts. But if you're in a triage situation at elementary school and you got a high population of kids that are below age level in regards to the reading or math, and you are in an emergency situation with every student, with a large group of students every day, that just compounds your ability to be able to effectively educate those students. And then, they just move on to the next school that is in the same situation. So, it's about dispersing, and the same thing with the affordable housing throughout the city. It's about dispersing some of the load around the city, so one area of town is not carrying, the biggest bulk of the load, and better equitably serve these families and these young people.
Definitely. And so I think that provides a really great lens to look at some of that scattered site development for affordable housing moving forward. So as we wind down on time a little bit, I do want to mention, that this history that Mr. Rothstein talked about and the issues that are being talked about here, this wasn't discovered by white folks like Mr. Rothstein or myself or others. This is a history that people of color have been telling for generations and generations. Residents from redlined and gentrifying communities have stories and solutions to the issues that many of us have the privilege to only read about. So how can we, in closing, as a city, as nonprofits, as academics, as neighbors, really invest in and empower those within the East End, Prawltown, Brucetown, Goodlowtown, Spiegel Heights, many of these neighborhoods that were traditionally and historically redlined. How can we invest in and empower those communities to implement neighborhood level solutions?
Justin, I'll start. I think it's first to start acknowledging there's a situation. Acknowledge that it's directly tied to race, and then I think we commit as a community to work on and work on them together and look to address them together. There's recommendations put out there from the Commission on Racial Justice and Equality that need to be implemented. There's going to be recommendations coming from the Task Force in Neighborhoods in Transition that need to be looked at and implemented. And then, the solutions are there. We have just got to knuckle down, acknowledge that systematic racism exists and a lot of these structures that we have in place, and do the work and make the changes that we need to make to give folks the best chance possible to be successful.
James said, systemic racism is there. And we have to admit that over the last 4 years, it's gotten worse. And so the hole is deeper. So our efforts are going to have to be ratcheted up even more. And it's going to take collaboration among all people, black and white, to get this train back on track, because it's just gotten much worse over the last 4 years. And I'll just leave it at that.
So I would never pretend to speak to policymakers in the room about this, but as a professor, I can't help but think there's still a huge amount of education that goes on. And as you started out, it's mostly education for white people. Pointing out, that as Mr. Peoples just said, not only have things not gone away, they've probably gotten worse. I think the most powerful passages in Mr. Rothstein's books are the ones that are the narratives and the stories of some of the people he interviewed, who were telling us firsthand about things that happened to them. And you start to realize, at least I realized again, that we still have this notion that everybody who's starting out is starting out at the start line and is running a race, and we forget that the start line's been moved for a whole lot of folks. There used to be a theory about international development called the development of underdevelopment that pointed out that countries that have been exploited for 400 years didn't have the resources to go forward. And we've done that in many ways to parts of our cities and to the people who live there. And I think we still need to address that in education. I can do it in the classroom. I can do it in public talks and other ways, but it's not the policy solution that these two are talking about.
No, and I think that that educational aspect of this, that's one of our goals here today is these conversations have been happening for years. We're just attempting to amplify them, and as we continue to look for solutions, and based on the comments, of course, folks want solutions. So as we build that political will that Mr. Rothstein talked about, and I think that has to happen through education. So I wanted to put it out there to our panelists here. If you had any closing thoughts, on redlining and gentrification and where we can go from here.
Mine may not be an answer to that, but I just hope that if this session was intended to be about educating, I hope the people who need to be educated about the issues are listening, and that we're just not, preaching to the choir. I know we probably got people on here who are housing providers and who understand and are sympathetic with the issues that we raise, but they're already on the team. I just hope we gain some supporters through this kind of an educational process.
And Justin, I'll just say thank you to you and for the Community Land Trust for doing this panel and showing the film. And I'll go back to what I said. It's going to take all of us working at it. And it's not just the policymakers downtown. It's going to be the community. It's going to be the private sector, the nonprofit sector, the educational community as well. And I think PG's right. It's Black folks have been screaming this for years. I think it means something, and actually means that, hopefully it means that we're gaining some ground, that the white folks are saying it as well. And I think that's what we seen last year with all the activists and all the activities that took place. It was a mixed bag of folks out there in the streets calling for change, and I think that's what we need to happen. So yeah, so thanks for this panel, and thanks for having a hard, tough conversation.
I can't do any better than those two.
No, I appreciate that. I think, we have an obligation to listen, and we have an obligation to act. And I think that much is clear from today's conversation. So I certainly want to say thank you to Councilmember James Brown, thank you to Mr. PG Peoples, and thank you to Dr. Richard Shine, all of who volunteered their Thursday afternoon to speak with us, as James said, about this tough topic. So I want to thank you all again. And then, just in closing, I wanted to say thank you to everyone who has joined us today. This has been, I think, a great event. We really look forward to continuing this conversation through future events. So please stay up to date on Lexington Community Land Trust Facebook page. Thank you again to Mr. Rothstein and our panelists here this afternoon. Thank you to Lexington Fair Housing Council and the Lexington Human Rights Commission, who co-presented this opportunity, and the PNC Bank Foundation, who made this event possible. I think it's clear that we have a mandate moving forward, and we definitely look forward to the continuation of the Mayor's Commission on Racial Justice and Equity, so that we can provide some community-based solutions for these issues that so many of our neighbors face. So thank you again, and we look forward to continuing these conversations in the future.